Good evening, and thank you and welcome for coming out tonight. I know there are a lot of events, including one of our few first warm days that are competing for your attention, so it's truly nice to see everyone here tonight. I'd like to quickly thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for the funds that made tonight's talk possible and Dr. Asma's visit possible as well. And I'll go ahead and quickly introduce Dr. Asma for you. Stephen Asma is a professor of philosophy at Columbia College, Chicago, where he is recognized as a distinguished scholar. He's also a founding fellow of the research group in mind, science, and culture at Columbia College. He's the author of 7 books, including books on monsters, Buddhism, natural history museums, and of course tonight's book, Against Fairness. He has authored over 39 articles that have appeared in both academic peer-reviewed journals as well as popular press journals, including the Chronicle of Higher Education and the New York Times. He teaches classes in a variety of classes, but some of the ones I found more interesting at least were Eastern philosophy, evolution of the mind, religion and science, and philosophical issues in film. He is also a graduate instructor at the Buddhist Institute in Phnom Penh, Kingdom of Cambodia. He has been a guest lecturer at places as diverse as Harvard, the Newberry Library, and the Smithsonian National Museum of History. He is a recurring guest on numerous radio shows and has appeared on both the BBC World News and MTV. In addition, this has nothing to do with what he'll be doing tonight, but I'm in awe of anybody who has many wide varying talents as Stephen does. He is an accomplished musician who plays blues music and has accompanied Bo Diddley, B.B. King, and Buddy Guy. And he is also has been in a former life a professional freelance illustrator. If you have looked at any of his books, you'll notice that he does many of the illustrations in his own books, so a true Renaissance man. His most recent book, Against Fairness, is a thoughtful argument about giving favoritism its due, and provides a provocative critique of impartiality and our cultural obsession with it. If you are at all intrigued by his ideas and would like a copy of his book, our bookstore has graciously agreed to be here tonight with copies of it available. And without any further ado, I would ask you to please help me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Asma.
Okay, thank you for that excellent introduction. I'm kind of embarrassed by my own introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out. As Shane said, there's lots of demands on your time and lots of options, including sports options, I understand, for this evening. Special thanks to Shane Miller for inviting me and having me out to the campus. And it's an amazing campus. I've really enjoyed my time here in the hospitality. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about this thesis, Against Fairness. And you might be thinking, like, who could be against fairness? This is like being against motherhood or apple pie or something, or baseball. And I'll admit that making this argument has been sometimes frustrating and difficult because it's really the national creed. So I want to start with just sort of showing you where I think favoritism and fairness clash, why I think we need to bring more nepotism and favoritism into the ethical discussion, and then hopefully make a case for this later in the talk. Let's start here, though, which is everybody recognizes Lady Justice, and I think it's common for Americans and Westerners in general to think of justice entirely in terms of fairness. This is a long-standing tradition. It's been codified in professional philosophical circles, most recently by a philosopher named John Rawls, who argued that justice is fairness, and he's been very persuasive to professionals. But I think professionals aside, you and I and the average person grows up learning that fairness is the moral language. And here we see the classic expression of Lady Justice, who is balancing competing claims, but does so with a blindfold on. And the metaphor here, the sort of allegory is that justice does not recognize who is being judged. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's your father, your mother, your sister, your friend, or a perfect stranger. Justice should be applied universally the same in an equal measure. And so this is part of our longstanding tradition of fairness. Now, my own view is that I was raised on this, and I appreciate it, and I'm a fan of it, but it's a kind of anemic way of thinking about ethics. As a way of describing our duties, obligations, and our responsibilities to other people, it's fairly thin stuff. And I want to try to show why I think that's the case. So first, what is fairness? It turns out that Americans and a lot of Westerners are using the term in a way that's quite different. So I've put up here the right and the left, and I thought I would give you two very strong senses of fairness. In our country, the right, the conservative view of fairness is what I'll call meritocracy. That means that the fair thing to do would be to give the most excellent or skilled or accomplished person the rewards, the desserts. This is, I think, well known, and you'll hear this oftentimes from the side of the Republicans and on the right. What we need to do is give people what they have earned, and not a penny more, not a penny less. That's the way to think about fairness. Opposing that is the sort of liberal view of egalitarianism, which is that everyone should be treated the same. There should be either equal opportunities or equal outcomes or both. And so when the left and the right is talking about fairness, they're actually talking about two different things altogether. I'll give you two little sort of trivial illustrations of this. They're kind of funny. Maybe they're not so trivial because they're sort of examples from childhood. When my son went to school in Chicago, he was about maybe I think in third grade, and he came home and he showed me he had a ribbon that said he had won the race, the foot race. And I was all ecstatic, as his father. I'm like, God, you won the race. That's amazing. Way to go. High five, all that. And then I said, so you beat everybody? And he said, no. He said, everybody got the same ribbon. And I was like, how can you all have gotten the same ribbon? And I said, what place did you come in? And he was like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, something like that. I'm like, how could you win the race then? And he just held it up to me like, see, I won the race. And this is a sort of a classic case. I don't know whether you have this in Minnesota, but the Chicago Public School has adopted this view, which is it would be better that everybody feels like they won the race instead of some people feeling like bad about themselves, or this would damage their self-esteem, or it would in some way suggest some difference of skill or ability. And instead of recognizing anything like that, this is the solution that the Chicago Public School System has come up with. Now, I immediately told my son he did not win the race, ever supportive father that I am, and told him that is not winning the race. You have to come in first. And I said, how do you think the kid feels who ran his ass off and came in first place to see that everybody got the same ribbon? And he was like, oh, yeah. Now, that's more of the meritocracy view of fairness, that ribbon goes to the one kid who came in first, maybe second and third or whatever. So contrast this story then with a story from China. I've lived in China on and off for 10 years, sort of chunks at a time. And one of the things they do in Chinese, my son went to a Chinese preschool, he's half Chinese. One of the things they do in China is this wonderful tradition called the storyteller king. And this happens in preschool. And so imagine, in preschool, what are you, 4, 5, something like this, probably 4. All the kids gather around, and on your day, you were supposed to tell a story to the other kids. And so the kid gets up and tells the story, and you can imagine a 4-year-old having to construct a story in front of their classmates. This is very difficult to do, right? I mean, it's hard for you to do now. Apparently people, really hate getting up in front of other people and talking, except for professor types. So the kid gets up and tells the story, and then when it's over, everybody claps. And then the kid stands there while everybody in the room dissects and criticizes the story and shows all the ways that it was wrong and bad. One kid's like, it was boring. Another kid's like, you didn't have a good ending. The teacher gets in on it. It's this. And so when Western educators went and observed this, they were horrified by this. They just couldn't believe, oh my God, it's like child abuse. It's so cruel. But the idea was that through this kind of gauntlet of pain and fight and struggle, the real storyteller king would emerge. And that was a part of the Chinese educational experience. Now, that's real meritocracy at work, and you see it throughout Chinese culture too, which is whatever you earn is what you get. We were talking earlier today about the Chinese will post all the grades in order in public, so you'll know exactly what you got and what your friend got and where you sit on the line. And in the West here, the view is that if you were to do that to the student, it would somehow damage them. And they would be so hurt by this that they could potentially sue you for somehow abusing them. So these two notions of fairness are strong, but you can see that they're actually pitted against each other. And when you're talking from these two perspectives, you're basically talking at cross purposes. All right, so it's common then for us in the United States to think of ethics as fairness. And so I'm going to talk about this as being like a grid of impartiality. So what happened was, in the ancient world, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, there is sort of highs and lows, and imagine a sort of geography of your moral obligations. Who's really, really important to you? That's going to be like a mountain. Who's not very important to you? That's going to be a little hill. But starting in the Enlightenment period, in particular with philosophers like Kant and then eventually utilitarians, the argument was that everybody should be treated according to the same grid of impartiality. Everyone has the same space, neither more, neither less, and we can treat ethics like a kind of math problem. In fact, you see philosophers during this period saying, we want to do for ethics what Isaac Newton did for physics. We want to put everybody, instead of having like a whole set of forces for the moon and the planets, and then another set of physics forces down here, Newton basically combined physics and made just 4 laws that applied all the way out to the heavens and all the way down here to the sublunar realm. And the ethicists said, we want to do the same thing. So I think in the West, there's sort of 2 major themes or tendencies of fairness. And I would say one of them is religious fairness and the other is secular fairness. So let's just mention these quickly. You'll recognize both of these. The first, of course, Christian universal love, or agape, is well known. It's a huge part of the Western ethics. And it's the idea, ultimately, that you don't just take care of your close friends or your family, but you basically pay respect and love all people. And then radically, according to Jesus, you even love and respect your enemies. And so this is a very different view of ethics than the ancient world had. But it has shaped Western ethics for 2 millennia. In the secular version, I mentioned this already, but it's crucial that Kant in the Enlightenment, this is basically the 1700s. So think about like the time of our founding fathers. That's the sort of time frame we're talking about here. Jefferson, Franklin. And on the continent, Immanuel Kant argued that your rationality alone will be able to prove to you that you should treat all people as an end in themselves and not as a means to some end. And if you did that, it would be like the mathematical rule that would apply in every situation, and it would tell you the exact right thing to do. But it's premised on the idea that everybody gets the exact same treatment. Uniform laws of ethics, no exceptions. That was the Kantian view. Shortly after Kant, in the UK, and eventually in the United States, and really all over now, came this philosophy called utilitarianism. You'll recognize this too. This is the idea that the consequences matter to your ethical decisions. So what you want to do is maximize the greatest amount of good or happiness for the greatest number of people. And when you've done that, you've done the right thing. And so some of the utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill developed like a calculus. And they talked about units of happiness and pleasure as being hedons. And you plug the hedons into the formula, and then whatever produces the highest number of hedons, that's what you do, and now you have a just and a moral society. We were talking earlier, Shane and I, about the trolley car examples. It's sort of a classic way to get at this problem. Have you guys heard this case where you're standing on a bridge, and there's a trolley car heading down a track, and you have a switch? And you can either, there's sort of like 4 or 5 people on one track, and then the track splits off and there's just one person on the other track. And you have a switch that basically can either make it go towards the 4 people or towards the 1 person. Do you flip the switch towards the 1 person? What do you think? Show of hands? Okay, the vast majority of people will choose, if they have to harm, then they want to reduce the amount of harm and maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And so some people have said, well, this is an example of utilitarianism sort of like hardwired in the brain. I disagree with that interpretation, but I do accept that that's a natural inclination or tendency that we have. All right. Now, one result of this is Montesquieu very famously said, well, okay, given all of that I just said, the truly virtuous person would have no friends. Why? Because if you have friends, that will basically mean you have loyalties and allegiances, and you won't be able to be good to everybody because you'll have this preferential bias towards 1 or 2 people. So the perfectly good person has a sort of equal distribution of their moral activity and their duty. And they don't sort of put some people on a pedestal. So it doesn't matter if it's your mother, your son, your friend. Ultimately, the idea is to sort of distribute the good equally. So that's a pretty dramatic expression of it. All right. Now, my view is that this has been a kind of false dichotomy. If you look at, first thing that happened when this book came out was a bunch of people who didn't read it said, that Asma guy, he is like some kind of Ayn Rand selfish nut job. He must be for selfishness. So if anybody's against fairness, he must be for selfishness, right? Ayn Rand, you may recall, wrote a bunch of famous novels and argued the best thing to do is to sort of go for me and mine, and that'll produce a better society. That is not my view. That has never been my view. That is a false dichotomy. If you're against fairness, it doesn't mean you're for selfishness. We tend to think about ethics as either you're saintly and you're distributing your ethical loyalty to everybody, or you're somehow out for yourself and you're an egotist. What's missing from this, however, is the middle ground. What's missing from this is the family. And I think the false dichotomy prevents a much more interesting conversation from happening. So here we have the nuclear family of our nearest cousins. And so now I want to try to build this case for favoritism, in which I think family, friends, and tribes, in a sort of generic sense, tribes, are very important ethical units. So natural preference, partiality, and bias is when I want to try to argue is not as bad as you think it is. We're raised to think this is horrible stuff, but in point of fact, 2 things. 1, we all do this, so there's sort of the factual description that we do play favorites with our families. And then 2, I want to argue that a sort of normative claim, which is maybe we should do this, at least sometimes. So those are 2 different points I want to make. All right. We all in this room share some very specific emotional equipment with other mammals. There's a specific neural pathways in your brain that are the same in a primate like this and even in a squirrel. And that neural pathway has been discovered by neuroscientists to be basically 7 different emotional signatures. One of them is called the care system. And the care system is actually driven mostly by oxytocin and opioids, but it's the thing that bonds you to your family. And it's very important when your mother gave birth to you, your body and brain and your mother's body and brain flooded with oxytocin. It's the sort of neurotransmitter glue that bonds you and your mom together, and your dad and other caregivers. It turns out it's the exact same thing for other mammals. It's one of the things that makes mammals similar. This bonding window for human beings. It's open for a long time, like almost 2 years. You can basically, like, they've had these kids. They've found kids in orphanages that were not immediately cared for by parents. But if they're adopted within 6 months, a year, even 18 months, they can still forge very strong bonding equipment because their oxytocin system can still be primed. But after this 2-year period, the oxytocin system is broken. And in other mammals, the oxytocin system is very small. Like in a sheep, like the mother has to nurse and lick and clean the baby within 1 to 2 hours after she's given birth. If she does not, like if some mad scientist takes her away and then brings her back 2 hours later, this oxytocin window has closed and the mother will reject the baby. But what's amazing is if this same mad scientist injects oxytocin into the brain of the mother, the bonding window opens again and she can bond with the offspring. So it's fairly amazing that we've learned this about the brain and about something so intimate as sort of bonding and preferential attachment. If you fail to have this system operated or primed, you end up having attachment disorders. It's very hard for you later in life to form attachments. All right, this is why, for example, you've seen this. They used to be like, oh, when a baby's born, they take it off into some other room and put it under some French fry light, and the mother would come in later. But now what do they do when the baby's born? They put it right on the mother right away, usually like skin on skin. That's because it has to prime this oxytocin system. Okay, what I'm going to argue here is that this system then was built by evolution and by nature to forge these strong preferential connections between us and our families. Okay, favoritism contradicts egalitarianism. Now, there's several forms of egalitarianism. I have a couple of images here. Up in the upper left-hand corner is an image of the Buddha with his head kind of chopped off. But the Buddha is a very famous egalitarian. He looked at the Hindu culture that was around him, and he said, this is essentially wrong, and we should not our duty should not be towards people of a specific caste or class, but should be towards all beings. And so he's very famous for basically spreading the kind of compassion and empathy to the widest group possible, including other animals. Next to him, we have Jesus, and Jesus very famously believed in the kind of egalitarianism that I mentioned earlier. I don't think there's more to say on that right now, but perhaps you're not as familiar with Gandhi's claim that he basically reiterated Montague's claim in his autobiography. He said, you can't love one or two people more than others, because that will prevent you from loving everybody. So you should avoid having like close friends and close loves. And so he writes this in his autobiography. And the guy below here is George Orwell. I brought a little quote here from Orwell. Orwell read Gandhi's autobiography, and he reviewed it. And he thought, okay, Gandhi is pretty great, and he remained impressed by Gandhi's political successes. But he thought that Gandhi had gotten something really wrong about being human. And he thought Gandhi was too much of an idealist for humans, and he wanted to correct him. So he said, saintly egalitarianism seemed repugnant to Orwell, who believed that, quote, love means nothing if it does not mean loving some people more than others. That's what he said in his review. Orwell's claim was, quote, the essence of being human is that one does not seek perfection, that one is sometimes willing to commit sins for the sake of loyalty, and that one is prepared in the end to be defeated and broken up by life, which is the inevitable price of fastening one's love upon other human individuals. So Orwell's position was it's anti-humanist for this kind of radical egalitarian love to be the ideal. All right. Now, in the same way that favoritism contradicts the egalitarian view of everybody is equal, it also throws a wrench in meritocracy. Now think about meritocracy. This is the idea that the person who does the best deserves the most rewards. And in fact, favoritism is not that view. Because your favorites are not the most excellent people you know. Think about it. Who are your favorites? Are they in fact the most amazing people that have ever done X, Y, and Z? Or are they in fact just members of your family and you have history with them? Do you just seek, when you seek out your friends, are you looking for, well, that guy's really the best tennis player, so I'm going to try to make friends with him? That's really not how friendship works, right? You don't have favorites based on their excellence. I mean, it would be great if we did, but we don't. So my view here is that favoritism or nepotism contradicts meritocracy too. It's a problem for both views of fairness, both the left and the right. And as such, it's not even included in the conversation. So here's a sort of a fun image here on the left. This is Aeneas, which is from the Trojan War, Trojan hero, considered a great exemplar of favoritism and nepotism in the ancient world because he's saving his son on the bottom there and his father as they leave out of Troy. So there are images like this in the ancient world all over the place. So I'm just sort of pointing out that there's this strong tradition. All right, now, let's talk about weird cultures, which is you and I. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrial, rich democracies. You, me. And this is where most of our ethical views are coming from, are weird cultures. And that's who we are, but it would be naive of us to think that that's the majority of the planet. The majority of the planet has a very different view. It's not weird in this way. It's weird in another way. I'm calling the other parts of the world China, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. I'm calling them the particularists. For them, they don't believe that everybody should be treated the same or equally. They believe that who you are, the particular person, is how we should sort of align our duties. So it matters if it's your father, or if it's your daughter, or if it's your friend. Then your duties for them are much stronger and bigger than if it's just some stranger. So up on the left-hand side, you'll see Socrates. The ancient Greeks did not understand fairness. If you said to Aristotle, you have to treat everybody equally, he would say, I don't even understand what you're talking about. It's clear from the ethics, he thinks that the very worst thing you can do is something against your father. So keep this in mind. He says, wronging your father is much worse than wronging anybody else. And of course, wronging a brother is worse than wronging a friend, and wronging a friend is worse than wronging just another citizen. So there's this scale of duties and obligations that sort of goes out from you like in concentric circles for Aristotle. In the middle here we have Confucius, or Kongzi, and Confucius also was a particularist. Confucius said, the way to be a good person, like Aristotle, he said, is to be a really good son or a really good daughter first. And then from there, you develop the skills to go out into the world and extend this kind of respect and good ethical treatment to the larger community. And I can't believe this is not sitting well with you, I suspect, probably because of your age. And as Americans, we have this kind of you're not the boss of me view. But Confucius thought if you were just a better son or daughter, then you could eventually become a better citizen, and then all of society would be better off. So his view was ethics comes out from the nuclear family in these sort of circles. And then on the right-hand side, I'm pointing out another culture that's a lot like this, another very big culture. There's 1.3 billion Chinese. There's a very similar number of Indians, of East Indians. Their culture is also not weird. It's not Western, educated, industrial, rich democracy. It has some of this, obviously. It's a democracy. they also have a very hierarchical view of ethics. They would never think about treating everybody the same. For them, coming out of Vedic culture, if you're in the warrior caste, it's your ethical duty to be a good warrior. If you're from the priestly caste, the Brahmin, it's your ethical duty to be a good priest, to sustain the scriptures and that sort of thing. So ethics then is very differential, depending on who you are and where you are in the society. All right, this is a great idiom that the Chinese have. I was in China last year, and one of the students was telling me this idiom. He said, the Chinese say, my elbow only bends inward. And what this means is that it means that you protect your family inside this circle. So your elbow's bent in, and your family is inside the circle. Their claim was if you actually are good to strangers and not good to your family, then your elbow bends in the wrong direction. That's their idiom for describing this. Now, this is a very famous story then from Confucius, which is, he tells this story. The Duke of Shi told Confucius, in my land we have very righteous men. If a father steals a sheep, the son will testify against him. And so I asked my American students this question. Let's say your dad comes home and he's like, the cops are after me. Can you hide me in the basement? What's your response? Well, they want to hear all kinds of qualifiers. What's he done? Is it bad? Why did he do it? And then half the students will usually give up their dad if I tell the story right. But when I ask this student in China, nobody ever gives up their dad, no matter what I add to the example. I keep making the crime worse and worse and worse. And the Chinese student is like, no, not going to give him up. Because look, Confucius says, the righteous are different in my land. The son shields the father shields the son. This is righteousness. That's what Confucius says. That's a totally different view of the good and ethics than we have. And yet, it's sort of the dominant view in a large part of the world. So this is what I'm calling sort of favoritism and nepotism. All right. All right, so Chinese philosophy is also very complex, and they don't have a simplistic view. They've got a complex view. And one of the things that happens in the Warring States period is this debate between the Confucians and the legalists. So what's going to happen if your family and my family and all of your families are basically just out for themselves? You're not going to have a very successful society, right? It's just going to be like gang warfare of some kind. So you need to fold this into a larger social ethic where everybody can basically survive in a large-scale society, which was the major problem at this time in China. But it's still the major problem we have. So on the left-hand side, we have Mozi. Mozi basically was a legalist, and he said, okay, Confucius, you've got this idea of virtue, and everybody should feel like filial piety and nepotism, which the Chinese call shao. That's when you're devoted to your family more than anybody else. But he says, we have to change this, Mozi says. Mozi says, we must replace partiality with impartiality, which is jian-ai. And he says, other parents are your parents. He says what you should do is, look at the bottom one now on the left-hand side. If I treat the stranger's father as my father, then strangers will treat my father reciprocally. So this is not a bad plan, right? If you at least treat your the other citizens and neighbors' fathers with the same respect, then that respect is going to come back on your family. It's going to lead to a better society at this large scale. Then comes Mengzi on the right. Mengzi is a Confucian scholar who comes shortly after Mozi, and he says, no way. Look at the top here. He says, to have impartial care, or jian-ai, is to be without a father. And he says, caring for everyone is not real care. So you could do this, but it would not be love, it would not be care, it would not be the real thing, it would be something else. You could have a society that follows the rules and governs well, but you would not have the strong bonds and connections that you need to be a human being, to be in a family. So that debate is very old. It's still with us in some form. I'm obviously tilting towards Mengzi and sort of arguing that view because I don't think it's well represented in society. Okay, so now what's wrong with fairness? I'm going to try to now enter this other phase of the argument, which is I've described that you and I are all preferential and we treat our friends and family with great favoritism and nepotism. But now, should we do this? And so I offer two sort of interesting examples of failures of fairness. One is called the Jellyby fallacy. The Jellyby fallacy is named after Mrs. Jellyby, who's from a Charles Dickens novel called Bleak House. And this character is kind of an amusing character. She is not very good to her own family, but she's very devoted to these strangers who she's read about in some faraway tribe of Africa. So she does all this philanthropy for them, but she does not take care of her own family. So if we were Chinese and we were looking at this, we would say her elbows bend the wrong way, right? That's the Jellyby fallacy. And some of you probably know this. You know people like this. They're more devoted to strangers than they are to their own families, who sometimes they can't stand. And it's fine. Everybody's got a different kind of family. Now, the second one is Zell Kravinsky, and this is an interesting case because Kravinsky is fairly famous as of late as an American entrepreneur, and he's made headlines because he gave away $45 million to charity. Has anybody ever heard of Zell Kravinsky? Okay. He hasn't been on Oprah, so that would have probably put him through. But all right, he not only did he give away $45 million to charity, that is impressive, but he also gave his kidney to a perfect stranger. And people were like, what are you doing? And then he said, not only am I going to give away all my money and my kidney, but I'm ready to give my other kidney, which, by the way, you can't live without, if I come across some noble doctor who's, doing great work. Now, what do you think of this guy? Saint? Nut job? Okay. Some people think he's a saint. Some people think he's a nut job. I leave it to you to make the decision. But here's the interesting thing about it is he says of himself, his friends with a very famous utilitarian philosopher named Peter Singer. He said, Kravinsky says, I'm basically doing what everybody should be doing if we believe in egalitarian ethics. Because he said, what's good for me is no better and no worse than what's good for you. And the same is true, my family is not above or below you. We're all equal, and we should all be treated equally. And so he thinks he's following through the logical implications of an egalitarian view of the world. Now, I thought, okay, fine, whatever you want to do with your kidneys. But doesn't his family have some claim on him? Like if he's given away all of his wealth and he's basically willing to give away his life, is this unfair to his family? Like his kids surely, doesn't he owe his kids more than that? And then it came out that it was not well known originally, but it came out that he had set aside $1 million in trust funds for his children to go to, the very best schools before he gave away all this money and got very, very righteous about it. And so for him, it's not a big contest. He can take care of his tribe, he can provision them, and he can take care of a lot of strangers. For the rest of us, sometimes these two things come into competition with each other, taking care of your tribe and provisioning them and taking care of the wider citizenry. I would like to be both a good citizen and a good brother, but if I can't be both, then I'm going to choose to be a good brother. That's what the favoritist says. Okay, so now what are the virtues of favoritism? Well, it should be obvious in a way. The first one is loyalty. One of the things that people have said is, well, there are no virtues in nepotism or favoritism. It's intrinsically corrupt and immoral. And I would want to say no. In fact, when you sort of practice favoritism with your family, you engage in the virtue of loyalty. You work on it. You are devoted to your family and your friends. They are devoted to you. You have their back. They have your back. That is part of the ethical framework that we consider to be really valuable. And so you can work on that virtue within the framework of nepotism. Have you ever been in an argument? Like, let's say you're with your friend, and your friend is arguing with somebody, and you can detect at some point that your friend is totally wrong. Now, do you stay backing them up, or do you point out that they're wrong? Now, when I ask that to my American students again, they say, well, yeah, right is right, wrong is wrong. I point out to my friend that they're wrong. and then they have to just sort of deal with it. But if I asked that to my Chinese students, they said, no, you always stick with your friend. Even when your friend is wrong and you know it, you still stick. Now later, maybe when the time is right and the person they're talking with is not around, you have a little talk with them and mention, hey, here's where you were wrong and here's some things you should think about. But in the moment, for them, loyalty is much more important than just getting the facts right. So that's my point about the virtue of loyalty, is that if that's what's sort of guiding you, it's going to give you a different sort of set of behaviors and actions. I think generosity and gratitude are also important virtues that can be practiced in nepotism and in favoritism. It doesn't make you more generous if you give your money to like hundreds of people or if you give your money to 5 people. The generosity is still the same. And so I don't think oftentimes generosity is linked with egalitarianism and fairness, and in fact it shouldn't be. They're logically distinct. And of course gratitude is also very important in favoritism, because people like your parents who have your back, like your brothers and your friends who have your back, they don't owe you that. In some sense, it's not because it's something you did that was really great, so your response to that has to be gratitude and gratefulness. And so that's a kind of virtue that can be worked on. All right. Here's another argument for favoritism, and I'll sort of I make 2 more points, and then we'll wrap up and see what you guys think and hear your questions and comments. Another reason why you should practice favoritism might be because it will make you happier. For a long time, psychologists were just doing what we would call pathology studies. You know, what's wrong with people? There are various neuroses and pathologies. But starting about 20 years ago and really picking up speed 15 years ago, there's been a lot more work on positive psychology studies and happiness studies. The longest running happiness study is the Harvard Grant Study. For 75 years, they've been collecting data on almost 300 people. 75 years they've been tracking these people. Now, most of these subjects are in their 90s now, and many of them have died, of course, but the data is amazing. What the data shows is that if you ask somebody like, what is the major ingredient to being happy, it's not money. It's not honor and recognition. The sort of single greatest ingredient in being happy is strong bonds, strong friendships, or strong family bonds. Weak bonds people are much more depressed and unhappy. Strong bonds, and they report much higher levels of happiness. And so the argument I'm making here is that if you operated in this way, you might do all that work that's necessary for forging strong friendships. I mean, think how hard it is to sustain a friendship. It's not easy. It's not the people clicking like on your Facebook page. That's not a real friendship, by the way. I'm sure you know that, right? The real friend is the one who's actually coming when you're sick with the chicken soup to your house, or watching your kid, or whatever. I mean, it takes calories to be somebody's friend. You have to burn calories to be their friend. You have to do things with them and for them. And our culture is setting up all kinds of ways in which that is happening less and less. And so my argument is that if you forge these strong bonds, it may in fact lead to greater happiness in a sort of Aristotelian argument, not, oh, you're going to feel good all the time. No, you won't. It's very hard work to make all the self-sacrifices for your friends that you have to do. It's very hard work. It doesn't feel good all the time. But in the Aristotelian sense of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, it may in fact be the greatest ingredient that you have for being happy. All right, I'll skip this discussion of resentment and envy, but if you want to talk about it, we can. All right, let me summarize this argument and then give you a kind of a fun thought experiment. Fairness is a recent tradition. We tend to think that the notion of ethics and justice is automatically fairness, and everybody agrees with that, but that's very short-sighted historically. So I've been trying to make the argument that the ancient West is very much, has not been for egalitarianism and has been more for preferential treatment. Secondly, fairness is geographically and culturally idiosyncratic. That means, like, we're familiar with it, you grew up on it, so you think that's what the good is. But in point of fact, the rest of the world does not think that's what the good is. And so it's worth pointing this out. 3, skepticism about rationally grounded universalist ethics. Okay, what does this mean? there is a tradition that I'm arguing for that comes out of like David Hume in the West, which is your ethics comes more from your emotions, how you feel towards people, rather than just your logic and rationality. It's Kant and the sort of rationalists who think you can have a math or a science of ethics. And I'm arguing there's a whole other tradition and way of thinking about ethics that has to do with cultivating the right kinds of emotions and feelings towards people. So that's a sort of critique of fairness. Lastly, virtue ethics approach. Favoritism inculcates the virtue of loyalty and some of these other things too. So these are the arguments that are not just recognizing that we're all favoritists, but maybe why it's good to cultivate some of this. All right, last example, and then we'll hear what you think. There's a famous utilitarian philosopher named William Godwin. He's an 18th century philosopher, and he tells this thought experiment. I'm contrasting him here with Cicero. Cicero's an ancient Roman philosopher, not a Stoic, but in many ways contemporary of some of the Stoics. And Cicero says, society and human fellowship will be best served if we confer the most kindness on those whom we are most closely associated. So again, that's the sort of favoritism position. But now here's good Godwin. Godwin says, imagine you're walking down the street and you come across this building and there's a terrible fire raging in it, and you run in and there's two people in the room. And one of them is, I'll sort of update this example. One of them is the president, and the other is the chambermaid, the maid, the house cleaner. Now you can only save one of them before the whole building collapses. Which one do you save? The chambermaid? You're bizarre. Why the chambermaid? Yeah, I can see that. You have no way to defend this. That's fine. You will here in a moment. But won't most people, in fact, save the president in this scenario? Why? Because the utilitarian logic, again, is the president is a more valuable person because he's going to do good for a much larger number of people. Maybe on the global theater, he's going to do good, whereas the chambermaid is not. So from a purely utilitarian view, a sort of math of ethics, save the president. But then Godwin says, okay, here's the catch. The chambermaid is, in fact, your mom. So maybe that's her job. She's there. Now who do you save? Whose intuition is for the mom? Who's still going to go with the president? No value judgment here. I'm just, but most people switched. Maybe some people don't know which way to go, and that's fine. Godwin said the right thing to do is still to save the president because this view of fairness is to sort of maximize the good for the greatest number, and to ignore your biased connections and partial bonding with family members. So Godwin bites the bullet and says, you still have to save the president. Now, I've been arguing, save your mom throughout this. So that's where I come down. All right, so I'll wrap up my formal comments there, and then hopefully you guys will have comments or questions. So let's do that. Thank you. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and I'll hear you out. Yes.
What would you do in this scenario?
I would save my mom. Yeah. That might not produce the greatest good for the greatest number, and maybe, it would be bad for society, but at some point, there are these scenarios like this where you have to choose which ethical universe you're going to live in. And it would be great if you could make them basically jibe together, the common good and what's good for your family. But sometimes you can't, and in that case, I'm arguing for this favoritism. Yeah?
What inspired you to do this research on this topic?
I had a kid. Like, seriously, that is what inspired me to do this, because I had a kid, and I was a completely devoted egalitarian, just like you guys are, and I believe in fairness for all, and I was raised a good Catholic, and all of that, and I do believe in all of that at some level. We have to, as a society, have those ideals. They can't go away entirely. But then I realized at some point, like, my kid is such a huge, like, feature of my moral universe that I would do almost anything for him. And if it meant that a lot of people might get hurt, I still would take care of my kid first. And that's what got me interested. I mean, that's just a feeling. From there, then I started to look into it more carefully and do the anthropology and look at the history and see that there is actually, that feeling is sort of nested within a larger theory that I'm calling favoritism. But it's not well known or acknowledged. I think we sort of secretly acknowledge it in our culture because we like stuff that is about loyalty. Like, how many people liked The Sopranos, right? Or The Godfather? It's not like you don't want to really end up in this family, but you also see that they're willing to sort of like go to the wall no matter what for each other. And there's something in that I think is still very appealing, even though we don't have a good ethical language for talking about it. So that's what that's what tipped it off. Yeah.
I'm deeply sympathetic with a lot of things you're saying. I think that a lot of modern political philosophy is built on a delusion. I like that you're targeting certain aspects of roles here. I also think that a lot of people do share these commitments, despite their giving lip service to this kind of general egalitarianism. And this is a fine example to bear it out. I am, though, concerned with, one of the reasons that I think Kant and Mill fail is because they want to reduce ethical principles in the ethical life to a single sort of issue, right? So rationality, you can have an algorithmic process with Kant's formula of humanity, or FUL, and we get the greatest happiness principle in Mill's, right? Philosophy, and always nice and tidy. We can just back it up this way. Now, somebody could sort of try that move on your end too, and I don't want to attribute that to you, but somebody could say, oh, right, fairness is favoritism is where it's all at. But you could imagine a kind of moral chaos and a lot of really untoward things developing if somebody adopted that view. Now, I don't think that's what you want, but I was wondering if you could comment a bit about a kind of do I want to use the word reflecting equilibrium?
Right. Right.
And what you're rejecting. But I'm thinking of things like, Jesus' philosophy. There is egalitarianism, but it's not a kind of milquetoast, cosmopolitan impartiality through and through. I mean, he's got relationships with the disciples, and there's special treatment and things that he does with them, right?
Yeah, he has a favorite disciple, right? John. So, yeah.
But I'm sort of wondering, he is also trying to expand the sensibilities of the people that he teaches to, because there is the plight of the fatherless and the widow, right? The moral luck leaves a lot of people without
Yes.
kind of bonds, without the familial or the friendly, the filial bonds, right? PHI. And so there needs to be regard, there needs to be an opportunity for them. So I was wondering what you could say to sort of, is there a kind of corrective here that you can have conversationally back and forth between favoritism and the need to step back from your impartiality so that others don't just get run over?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I don't want to leave the impression that, all of these universalizing projects are going to fail and that they should fail. They shouldn't. That's the level at which we have to build the larger social contract. But, and so I agree with you. And what I'm trying to do by writing the book is to sort of start that conversation of finding a better equilibrium or balance or fusion of these two traditions. My own worry is that none of that was happening. Who knows? None of it may still happen. It's just one book and a guy going around hawking it. But I do think you're right. There are failures on the other side. Like, if you look at, we were talking about this earlier today in class, if you look at Chinese society, which in many ways I'm clearly a fan of, because of these Confucian elements. The problem is that, okay, let's set Mao and the communist project aside for the moment, because it was just a blink of an eye compared to 2 millennia of Confucian values. What you find there is that all the problems of society are sort of held in at the family level. And then you're right, what happens when you have kids with disability, or you have kids, or you have like psychological problems, or you have family members die, and then in that society, you don't have the kind of safety net that the larger welfare society, has provided us with. And so that, I think, is a problem. You're right. If we just acted on this favoritism view, we'd end up with a society that makes sense sort of before we had really big cities. And we can't go back to that world, But my view is that the elemental sort of social unit is the family. And I'm not alone in this. I know that most anthropologists like Earl and Johnson have argued this. Like if you look and compare, human beings prefer to live in nuclear families. And they make these larger compacts and contracts sort of unwillingly, dragging their feet because of resource and provisioning. So I think there's this thing that Bernard Williams says, you probably know Williams is a big critic of utilitarianism and Kantianism for the reasons you were saying. You can't turn ethics into an algorithm. And Williams says, the thing about human beings is they have these ground projects. And so how I feel about my son, how I feel about my dad or my mom is part of this ground project. This is the existential meaning of who I am. So if I don't give them the utmost sort of respect and attention, if they don't loom large in my moral universe, then I'm not who I am. And that's what I think is missing from these algorithmic theories about ethics. How to get them together, I just don't know. I don't know exactly.
You might not be able to.
Yeah, you might not be able to.
Have you read George Harris's Reason's Brief?
No.
He basically says you can't.
Okay. Yeah.
But it takes a couple hundred pages to follow up. But you might like that book.
Yeah, I also agree that there's a certain aspect of Isaiah Berlin, his view of sort of human history and ideals, and I sort of agree with Berlin, because Berlin says you want to be able to synthesize all these notions of the good at all these different levels. There's something about our Platonic hope and our Christian hope that it's all going to be together in the beatific vision somehow. But Berlin was like, you can't be both a good leader running a state and a good Christian. You have to pick one or the other, because you kind of have to be a bit Machiavellian if you're going to be a really good ruler. This is Berlin's analysis of sort of Machiavelli's The Prince. And I think that might be true. There might be places where you just cannot get these two together and you just have to choose. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to your son and the race.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a point in any kind of favoritism or being partial to one group or the other, to family and so on, to friends, that you have to also bring in something about truth, honesty, and so you don't say to your son, "We really did win the race."
Right.
And so, you're introducing another element in there, which I think is beyond the partial and the egalitarianism. You're saying there's a value system in here that's independent of whether I'm partial or whether I'm in favor of egalitarianism. And how do you introduce that into your, I don't want to say calculus, but your consideration?
No, that's a great question, great point. I will need to think on this some more, but I think that's right. I would not want to. I was trying to give my son, and I would like for American kids in general to get some cold, hard truth about their own skill level, and instead of just sort of worrying about their self-esteem all the time. I don't think it's good preparation for us to worry about their self-esteem all the time. You have to face failure. You have to realize, my son is not a good runner. And the sooner he understands this, I feel like, well, I think the better. Like, let's come to grips with reality and, like you said, truth. But yeah, it cuts both ways because, of course, I want to privilege my son and help him wherever possible, but I don't want to violate truth. I don't want to like somehow lie and cheat and get him into the school that I want to get him into. That's not where this should go either. So you're right. There has to be almost like, if there's an axis of fairness and egalitarianism and an axis of favoritism and nepotism, there has to be some kind of truth axis as well. And I agree, we have to triangulate, I think, all of these concerns. And when you're raising a kid, I think the average parent is triangulating all three of those things. But it would have to be like a case, my view is that it would be a case-by-case basis. Truth is sort of like the good. There's a way of talking about it that's basically universal and always the same for everybody always, and there's no sort of exceptions. And then there's a way of talking about it where the exceptions matter, or that the particulars matter somehow. And so that comes up here, but I'm not sure how to resolve it either. But yeah, it's definitely a good point to think on. Yes?
Since this is an era when many people are concerned about fairness and social justice, what is your fair share of what someone else has worked for?
Good question. We're living in an era where there's terrible wealth inequality. And my argument is in no way an endorsement of the 1% having, their 1% and the rest of us struggling along. This is where, again, I think notions of fairness are helpful, are useful, and are crucial for developing a more just society. I think the system is broken. Capitalism, especially the way it's working now, is a problem. And it's not just capitalism, it's the sort of accumulation of family wealth in a very small group of people. So I think we can bring the lens of fairness to the economic question and criticize. It's obscene that some people are this rich. Yeah.
By saying the rest of us are struggling along, I think this is a bit of an overstatement. Since we live in America, we're still the top percentage of everyone in America is. And so there are some people who are better off, of course, but what value they brought to society is what makes it so. And so by saying that the rest of us are struggling along, even though we have people like Bill Gates and stuff, I think it's an overstatement.
It might be. You're absolutely right. Compared to the average Cambodian, I lived in Cambodia, everybody in here is wildly wealthy. But I also live in Chicago, and on the south side and on the west side, there are people who are very, very poor, and they are struggling almost like Cambodians are struggling. So you're right. It's relative. If we take your point, let's say Americans are by and large more prosperous and better off, then why are we making so much noise about the 1%? Now, this is an interesting argument, I think. I didn't mention this before, but maybe it's a time to talk about it. There is a lot of envy in Americans. And when Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States and he toured around, he said, Americans seem very motivated by envy. They feel like nobody should have more than me. And so when they see somebody who has more than them, they feel this anger and outrage and indignation, and then they dress up that envy in the language of fairness, and then they can scold people, and it's societally accepted to use this language of fairness, but fairness in that case may be just masking this kind of temper tantrum that we're having about this person has more than me. So that's an interesting point.
And I've seen that even the poorest people in Chicago are like the people in Cambodia. I mean, I don't know if that's a true picture because everyone in America has food, water, clothing, shelter, we have cars, phones. There's people who are barely surviving around the world. We're so wealthy. And it comes back to what is our fair share of what someone else has worked for?
Yeah. Good. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just wondering, I don't know if you addressed this in your book, but the envy and the resentment business, how do you, as a scholar with your research, connect that to a lot of the current talk across the nation in colleges about privilege?
Yeah. Oh boy, this is a minefield. I want to recognize, acknowledge, and praise the work that's being done on various forms of privilege. On the other hand, we live in a culture where we're overly sensitive about this, I think. And having lived in a place like Cambodia and traveled a lot in Africa, I have seen a lot of people who have much less than we have, like you were saying, like have very little, but they don't have the same sort of resentment and language and discourse about privilege. They're just getting about the business of surviving and thriving and trying to improve themselves. For example, when I was in Cambodia, I was teaching at the Buddhist Institute. I had maybe 15 graduate students. 5 of them, their families had been killed, not basically during the Khmer Rouge period and during the Vietnam conflict afterwards, during the Civil War afterwards. And so they'd lost family members and they were orphans and they were sleeping in basically on the floor at the local Buddhist temple. And then they were getting up and coming to school all day. Now, I didn't even know that about them. And I knew them fairly well for a long, long time because there is no culture of expectation, like you owe me something or you're oppressing me or I'm being discriminated against, or that culture is not really there. And as a result of it, it seems like the people in those cultures are much tougher. They're more stoic. They're like, I'm just going to get it done. Okay, there's forces against me. There's people against me. There's people rich. There's prejudice. There's all that. So what? I'm just still just going to get it done. Our culture, and I find this a lot because, I teach in a humanities program too. It's very subtly aware, and it likes to work on all the ways that the society has wronged me in some way. Like our students, I think, are exquisitely articulate about all the ways that society has kept them down, and they've been trained to talk this way. It's not their fault, and there are reasons why they should talk this way in some cases, but I think we're overly outraged, overly indignant, and I think in that sense the traveling gives you that perspective of a whole other culture that has actually, these people in Cambodia, they've suffered like nobody I know has suffered, and yet they still don't act like victims or think of themselves as victims. But we're really good at thinking of ourselves as victims, and we haven't suffered much at all, comparatively.
Well, let's thank Dr. Asma again.
Thank you.